Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have Kate Shaw with us today. We'll chat with Kate in just a little bit, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, before we get into the big things of the week, Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
What are you guys dressing as
Jen.
tonight?
I'm going as...
You're dressing as Jen?
Yeah. Not yet.
That would be really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going as Fluffy Northbrook, my porn name. And also a cat.
Okay, so the cat costume is Fluffy what?
Northbrook.
All right, Maddie?
Impressive. No, I spent all my creative time creating a scarecrow. So that will be my contribution to dressing up. And giving out lots of candy, which I would add is 30% more expensive this year due to our current situation.
Everything's political with
And
this
less
guy.
chocolate.
And less chocolate.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
But I will say, number one candy is also my favorite for giving out. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups.
Delicious.
All right, let's talk about the shutdown. Let's play this clip from Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow, who is also running to be the U.S. Senator from Michigan.
Make no mistake. There are years worth of funding available for the SNAP program, our tax dollars that we have already paid to the federal government to facilitate this program, and the Trump administration deleted this language from the website this morning. They are hiding the fact that not only is there more than enough funding to pay these benefits that we have already paid our tax dollars into, but that there was contingency language to ensure that even in the event of a government shutdown, that SNAP would go uninterrupted. The Trump administration and the Republicans supporting him are using food as a political weapon. This is a choice. They chose to delete this language. They are choosing to force children to go hungry. We will not stand for that choice, and I encourage a yes vote.
Because with Trump and the Republicans, it's all about the cruelty. They don't care. They don't care about people. They don't care about kids. They don't care about people going hungry and having to go on food bank lines. To them, it's just a big game. Because wealthy people don't worry about that shit, except that there are so many people in red states that are on SNAP and WIC food assistance programs. And that's why I think people are pissed off all across this country, not just Democrats, but independents and Republicans as well. Because if your kids can't eat, it really doesn't matter what party you belong to, right?
Yeah, that's very true. It's not just for blue states, that starvation, poverty thing.
I think the interesting thing about this is that when they passed the Orwellianly named bill, the Great Big Beautiful Bill, they had back-ended all of this to happen after 2026, when there was post-election. They didn't realize that insurance companies would start raising prices in anticipation of what they were doing. So all of this cruelty, which of course they planned for later, is happening much sooner, and especially because the Democrats have now pushed it forward by saying we're not going to participate in you cutting these healthcare benefits. And now, of course, SNAP is the other outcome of this. They have no idea how policy is made, and this is the result of it. The cruelty is coming way earlier than they ever anticipated.
Well, with Obamacare subsidies, which expire, the open enrollment is tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And so people are going to sit down with their computers and start logging on and looking for insurance policies, and they're going to be walloped by the increases they see. And as you said, specifically with Medicare, the language in the big ugly ass bill is that the cuts, I think $700 or $800 billion in cuts, don't take effect until after the midterms, because they know exactly what they're doing. They don't want people being impacted by this shit before they go to the polls. And that's what this is about. The one thing I could say about Republicans, especially Senate Majority Leader John Thune. These guys really care. They really care
Deeply.
about the people. They care about the kids. And John Thune got so angry this week. Let's play his very righteous clip.
You voted no 13 times. This isn't a political game. These are real people's lives that we're talking about. And you all have just figured out, 29 days in, that, there might be some consequences. There are people who run out of money. Yeah, we're 29 days in. And they've done their best to make sure that a lot of these programs are funded. But at some point, the government runs out of money. 13 times, people over here voted to fund SNAP. 13 times they voted to fund WIC. My aching back.
Here's the thing. When you are in control of all of Washington, D.C., the White House, the Senate, the House, you can get outraged all you want, but look in the fucking mirror, okay? This is all the Republicans doing because they decided that because we are in power, we don't care what Democrats think. We don't want their input. We don't want to sit down with them. We don't want to negotiate with them. We don't care what they want in a bill. We don't care what they don't want in a bill. And you know what? Andy Ostroy says that's fine. Elections have consequences. They're the majority party. They can say that. The only problem for them is then when they're done with that little diatribe, they then have to put their tail between their legs and go to Democrats and say, would you please vote for it? And Democrats are like, fuck you.
Except for John Fetterman.
He's not a Democrat. I'm so over Fetterman, by the way.
Agree.
But Democrats are not obligated to go, hey, guys, whatever it is you guys want, just put the paper in front of us and we'll vote on it. That's not what I voted to send them to Washington for. That's not why my fellow Democrats sent them. They vote for their constituents' best interests. And what the Democrats are doing right now, not only are they not responsible for the shutdown, but they are saying to Republicans, you want it all? Now govern. You don't want kids to go hungry? Govern. Okay? Govern. You can't blame us when you can't govern. When you are in power, you can't blame anyone but yourself. John Thune can stand there and be so fucking righteous and indignant. They don't give a fuck about Americans who aren't rich. They don't care if kids go hungry. They don't care if American families go without health care. It doesn't matter. So John Thune and his nice little performance mean absolutely nothing, which is why all the polls have shown an overwhelming majority of voters blaming his party for the shutdown.
And getting worse.
Yeah, of course.
The polls are showing that how disgusted Americans are. That's good.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, at some point, Americans need to wake up and say, who cares about me? You know, Donald Trump stole Reagan's Make America Great Again slogan. He literally took that from Ronald Reagan. He didn't make that up. Make America Great Again originated with Ronald Reagan. You know what else originated with Ronald Reagan? Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Democrats should borrow that. Because unless you're rich, the answer is no. And I think people are feeling it now. This shutdown is in its 31st day with no end in sight. SNAP benefits and WIC benefits, WIC being women, infants, and children, expire tomorrow. And John Thune, who controls perhaps the most powerful body in the world, he's outraged because of Democrats. Such bullshit.
As Mallory said, they don't need to do anything but allow the funds for everything that they're cutting off.
Yeah, contingency funds that have already been allocated. This is about money that's already been allocated by Congress. But there's that court case, which is probably going to be decided today. And I think the judge is going to force Trump and Republicans to release that money.
I think that's likely.
It's like $7 billion. It's insane. That could fund SNAP and WIC for like at least the next 2 or 3 weeks, maybe even through November, according to some reports I've seen.
Yeah. So they don't really care. Obviously, Thune is full of crap because he knows this. He knows they could do that. They could also even open Congress if it weren't for the Epstein files, and they could pass a temporary provision to give WIC and everything else funding that's important for people to eat.
Yeah. All right, we got an election coming up on Tuesday. Here's my prediction. The New York City mayoral race.
Yes.
It's either going to be way closer than people are estimating, or Cuomo could end up being mayor.
Anything's possible.
Exactly. All right, let's get to the winners and losers.
My winner, Senator Mark Warner, for condemning the Trump administration for Republicans violating the law requiring bipartisan briefings of congressional leaders on national security matters. My loser, the 42 million Americans who will be affected by the end of SNAP benefits tomorrow, November 1st.
My loser this week is Karine Jean-Pierre, whose book promotion has been a masterclass in evasion and incoherence, reinforcing every criticism leveled against her when she had a stint as White House press secretary. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of hearing pioneering environmental activist Bill McKibben on his new book tour. He is my winner for delivering an uncharacteristically hopeful message about renewable energy's future in a seemingly dark moment that we're in.
I have two winners. First one, knowing that Trump melts when flattered, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takachi gave Trump a golf bag signed by 2021 Masters champion Hideki Matsuyama, and also said she will nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Not to be outdone, South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung the next day gifted Trump a replica of a crown believed to have been worn by an ancient Korean ruler. He also gave Trump the Grand Order of Mugangwa, the country's highest decoration, in the form of a shiny, ornate necklace. You can't make this shit up, kids. And that gets us to the weekly rant. So the fear has been that Donald Trump aspires to be a dictator. I'm actually not so sure that's what ultimately is at play here. I think the dictator narrative might actually be oversimplifying what the true reality might actually be. The more logical, rational, likely scenario, although one less Hollywood, and equally consequential and dangerous, is that Donald Trump just never made the emotional transition from the Trump Organization's corner office to the Oval Office. He still sees himself as the boss, accountable to no one. Not Congress, not the courts, or the American people. He sees himself as America's chairman and CEO, a corporate big shot who makes all the decisions unilaterally, as evidenced by his myriad executive orders. Because to him, that's what bosses do. He says jump, and everyone else around him is expected to say how high. He has never operated in a system of co-equals, of checks and balances, of oversight. He's the big man, and he does whatever the fuck he wants, whenever the fuck he wants. And at the Trump org, God help you if you didn't do what he said. If you challenged him, you'd pay dearly. And that's how Donald Trump operates as president. Because it's not the Oval Office to him, it's just a different corner office. The White House is Trump Tower South and Mar-a-Lago North. America is just an extension of his company now, and everyone in the company reports to him and must be loyal to him, and only him. Congress, the courts, the media, to him they're all just different divisions of the company. Look, maybe I'm wrong here and Trump actually does aspire to be an actual dictator in a political sense, but I just don't think so. Because becoming an actual dictator requires a lot of thought, planning, and work. Trump is lazy. He's not strategic. He has no core philosophy or master plan. He's impulsive, erratic, and short-sighted. He makes all his decisions by ego, id, and whim. Those are not character traits of a typical dictator, at least based on the behavior of history's most notorious despots. It's really much simpler to just be Donald Trump. The same old Donald Trump he's been his entire life, which for all intents and purposes is just as authoritarian and oppressive. Perhaps Trump is just a common sociopath who doesn't give a flying fuck about anything or anyone but himself, and one who will ruthlessly destroy anyone who gets in his way. But that doesn't necessarily make him a dictator, per se, but rather just a rich, arrogant, entitled, unethical, corrupt business buffoon who's never been held accountable for his actions, and now, thanks to the United States Supreme Court, one who is essentially above the law. And that gets us to Kate Shaw. She is a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, where she teaches and writes about the presidency, the law of democracy, the Supreme Court, and reproductive rights and justice. Her scholarly writing has appeared, among other places, in the Harvard Law Review, the Columbia Law Review, the Michigan Law Review, and the Northwestern University Law Review, and her popular writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. She co-hosts the Supreme Court podcast Strict Scrutiny and is a contributing opinion writer with the New York Times. Kate, welcome into the back room.
Thanks so much for having me.
There's just so much going on with Trump 2.0. It's exhausting. It seems never-ending. So I want to start with you on his revenge campaign, his weaponization of the Department of Justice. And so let's start with some news from this week. We have two federal prosecutors, Carlos Valdivia and Samuel White. They were suspended just hours after they described the January 6th Capitol attack as perpetrated by, quote, thousands of people comprising a mob of rioters. This pertains to the sentencing memo for J. Sixer Taylor Taranto, who Trump pardoned and who's being sentenced for unrelated threats and firearms crimes. This just sounds, I don't even know what the words are, but U.S. attorneys getting fired for telling the truth.
Yeah, I mean, it is just wild that we have things have deteriorated to this point in less than 1 year since Trump took office for the second time. So, I think that there are a couple of things. One, we are seeing the Department of Justice turn into an arm of this kind of personalist presidency. So DOJ seems primarily to be engaged in a revenge campaign on behalf of President Trump, and also, assisting, it seems, with protecting allies and, colleagues of the president and his immediate circle. And there also seems to be, there has long been a firewall in all kinds of ways between the Department of Justice and the White House. That seems clearly to have been obliterated. But I think that what was so striking about the story this week was, the degree to which line-level prosecutors who are working on cases that are at what seems to be a remove from Trump and the White House, right? This, as you said, the charges at issue here were not about January 6th. He was pardoned for his January 6th conduct. This was separate misconduct. And yet even to make the, I think, uncontroversial historical characterization of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th as involving a mob and violence, that is, an offense that may be a firing or at least a suspension-worthy offense in this Department of Justice is really just jaw-dropping. But I think it gives us a sense of just how fully captured the Department of Justice has been by this White House and how largely an extension of the personal priorities of the president the Justice Department is at this moment.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the firewalls that traditionally exist between the White House and the DOJ. I mean, all we got to do is remember Merrick Garland. This man went out of his way to not sound political. And you contrast that with Attorney General Pam Bondi, who, whenever I see her speak, I really have to stop and go, she is the Attorney General, right? Not his publicist, not his personal attorney. And that's a very dangerous landscape that we're traversing right now, because when you combine that with the Supreme Court last year giving him basic immunity from everything and making him above the law, it's like, how do we combat this? Where does this go?
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. So the Attorney General, I thought in some ways her performance before the Senate, maybe it's 2-3 weeks ago at this point, where she really did sound like an attack dog for the president. Not
she sounded like a wife. I mean, I hate to say that, but she sounded like a wife defending a husband. It was so bizarre and abnormal to me.
Whatever it was not remotely recognizable as an Attorney General of the United States appearing to talk about the administration of the law, right? It felt like something entirely different. And yeah, I mean, the kind of personal lawyer piece is the history in part, right? So she was part of Trump's impeachment defense team. She was a close, kind of friend and ally when she was in Florida. And I think that it's not just Bondi, but Todd Blanche, the deputy attorney general, and a number of other officials who got their jobs because they worked in the private sphere for, President Trump in the interregnum of his presidencies, including as his defense attorney in an impeachment and criminal contexts. And those roles don't seem to have been discarded when they ascended to or returned to government service in the second Trump term. I think that to a fault, Merrick Garland was an impartial, honest broker who I think bent over backwards, I think to some people too much so, to maintain objective and nonpartisan, both actual and kind of appearance of the practice of the Department of Justice. But I think that it's obviously much more longstanding than that. When I was a young lawyer in the Obama White House counsel's office, we had these memos that every administration, I think until this one, has really taken very seriously, that kind of demarcated the boundaries between the Justice Department and the White House, and said that any contacts between political officials in the White House and the Department of Justice needed to be channeled through these very high-level people, wanted to make sure that, just political operatives in the White House were not calling up line lawyers at DOJ and saying, here's what you should say in this brief in this case. Like, it really was, these divisions were taken incredibly seriously. All of that is so long gone at this point. And I think you're right to pose the question, like, how do we ever return from it? And I don't have any kind of pat answer, but I will say that I think it's going to take a very, very long time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Help us understand the latest in the James Comey and Tish James cases, in particular the consolidated dismissal motions that now sit with the South Carolina Judge Cameron McGowan Curry involving U.S. Attorney Lindsay Halligan.
Right. So there are just, the appointments of interim or acting officials are governed by a fairly complex body of law that I think even real experts sometimes struggle both to make sure that they are understanding how to read together and to communicate to the public about. But the gist is that Halligan was improperly appointed to essentially serve on a temporary basis, right? U.S. attorneys are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, but the president does have, under a couple of different statutes, some power to temporarily install individuals. So that's Alina Habba in New Jersey and Lindsay Halligan in Virginia and a number of other acting U.S. attorneys, California and a few other places. And depending on the circumstances in which either the president made this appointment or in some cases the district court in which the U.S. attorney sits made the temporary appointment, there are real questions about the legality of these temporary positions. And so essentially the consolidated argument there is that this Halligan appointment was invalid. And because Halligan and Halligan alone signed the indictments of both Comey and James, if they prevail in their argument that Halligan was unlawfully appointed, I think it's likely that those cases have to be dismissed. If there are a number of different lawyers who are on the indictment, if one lawyer is unlawfully exercising the powers of the office, well, the others remain, validly in the offices that they occupy, and their signatures would cure any legal defect with Halligan's appointment. But I believe that it's just Halligan on those two indictments. And so, again, if they prevail, those indictments are tossed. And I think there is a question of whether a new indictment could be brought, but at least as I believe, far as Comey is concerned, I think the statute of limitations, insofar as we are even really clear on what specifically the alleged perjury is, because I think that as Comey's latest motion makes clear, it's not even that obvious what the lie, the alleged lie at issue even is. But if we're all right about what we think the charged conduct is, then I think that if Halligan is out, there's no way to recharge that conduct because it would be outside the statute of limitations. I don't think that's true about James, but certainly if Halligan's position is invalid, that would be an enormous win for both of them, and a win for, I think, kind of principles of fair process and justice more broadly, because I do think that as far as I can tell from the limited information we have, both of these cases are extraordinarily weak and very clearly about just vindictive prosecutions of the president's enemies.
Could James's case be moved to another U.S. attorney's office?
I think it's it's the locus of the kind of conduct, and I think that the documents at issue were Virginia documents. So I think it depends on how what the full kind of course of conduct was. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I think that I think that Virginia is the most natural place for that case to have been brought.
And the judge has asked for all documents pertaining to the grand jury proceedings, including all the transcripts, by Monday, I believe. Is that unusual? Is that concerning if you're the government?
I think that you could probably read it both ways. I think that if you're the government, you might say, well, maybe this is good, because if this was such an open and shut case, this was an invalid appointment, we're going to toss the case or the cases, you don't really need to look for underlying documents. So from that perspective, the government might think there is, some hopeful sign in the judge saying, well, I need to sort of get my arms around everything that's transpired. I think the other way to read it is this does seem facially like a strong disqualification motion. And the judge just really wants to make sure all I's are dotted and T's are crossed to, that it really was just Halligan alone who prepared and signed these documents, or at least as an official matter. I'm sure she did not prepare them without any assistance from some other individuals in the office that she now sits at the head of. But just to make sure that the kind of full factual picture is before the judge, before any ruling, just maybe about anticipating likely appellate review and making sure that any ruling is airtight. So I sort of want to reserve judgment. I'm not totally sure what to make of it. But I do think that the people who, as I said, this is pretty technical, but the people who I really trust on this seem to think that this disqualification motion is very strong.
And you mentioned Alina Habba before. There have been other unlawful appointment situations, Signal Chatta in Nevada, Ryan Ellison in New Mexico, and then this week, Bill Asaili in Southern California. Do you think if there is a development in the Comey and James cases, that would certainly be a strong indicator that the other cases are going to go the same way?
Well, as I said, I think there's at least some factual difference between some of these, because some, again, do involve an appointment by the president to a temporary position, and then some are by the district court. And so I think that because the factual backgrounds are somewhat different with respect to all those cases, I'm not sure that the outcome here in Virginia/South Carolina, but the James and Comey cases necessarily tell us much about the other cases.
Mm-hmm. And then we have Maryland U.S. Attorney Kelly Hayes. Recently, she told Deputy AG Todd Blanche that there's not enough evidence to charge Senator Adam Schiff from California with mortgage fraud. How do you see this one playing out?
I mean, look, we're relying on the public reporting on all of these episodes, but it does seem as though this president has been single-minded in his focus on finding something to tar these adversaries with. And I think that with respect to both Comey and James, it sounds as though there was initial resistance inside the U.S. attorney's offices about bringing both of those cases. And the administration just persisted with its pressure campaign until it was able to get these, charges brought before and then indictments returned by grand juries. And so, I mean, it sounds as though the case against Schiff, is this mortgage fraud case such as it is, extraordinarily weak. I think that's also true about the cases against both James and Comey. Obviously, James is mortgage fraud and Comey is this, perjury or false statements. But I guess I would not assume that Trump just takes that as the final word on pursuing Schiff. Now, look, I mean, a sitting senator is an enormous kind of another Rubicon to cross, but so is a sitting top law enforcement official of, the state of New York. And
we've had many
Rubicon
crossings.
Yeah, but it's significant. But I don't think that would be enough to give him pause. So I don't assume that chapter is closed.
Yeah. So Trump posted yesterday on Truth Social about his perceived enemies that have either already been indicted or perhaps might be next. This is what he posted, quote, "These thugs should all be investigated and put in prison. A disgrace to humanity. Deranged Jack Smith is a criminal, end quote.
So I missed that. Did he say anybody else, or was he naming others in that post?
That was just about, well, it was a more general,
I see.
these thugs, okay? But then the specific was about Jack Smith. And it would seem likely that Jack Smith could be among the next. Would a post like that help his defense, obviously?
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, kind of malicious or vindictive or selective prosecution claim is ordinarily very, very difficult to succeed in. The bar is high kind of by design, in that prosecutors generally have a lot of discretion, right? The federal criminal code is vast, and you really don't want judges second guessing all of the decisions that prosecutors make about why to bring a charge against a particular individual, and there are others who have also engaged in similar conduct who weren't charged. Like, it's just not something that courts in general are comfortable really getting deeply kind of involved with. And yet I think that post that you just read and some of the public statements about Comey and James, if things even get to that sort of kind of procedural point with those cases, I think that all of those people would have incredibly strong arguments for tossing these charges on selective or vindictive or malicious. They're all a little bit different, but closely related prosecution grounds. So, yeah, I mean, this is the person who is directing the Department of Justice. And as you alluded to in the beginning of our conversation, the Supreme Court in July of 2024 said in no uncertain terms that the president has total control over the investigation and enforcement of the law. And so, there's no question, I think, as these cases are actually playing out, but also as the Supreme Court has said, the Constitution kind of contemplates the president is the one calling the shots on this kind of law enforcement. And so if that person, the decision maker, is telling the world that he is singling out, directing his Justice Department at individuals because he believes they have wronged him, I think that's, about as strong a case as you could get for those kinds of defenses. So, I think that this is not at all to downplay or minimize just how much personal, emotional, financial kind of cost even being subject to one of these prosecutions can impose on an individual. But I do think all of these targets have very strong defenses that if judges and juries, if we ever get that far, actually in good faith and with open minds kind of consider their arguments, all of these people should win.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You hit on something a second ago, which I think is really the key, and that is it ultimately just depends on what Trump's end game is. Yeah. I personally don't think that he cares about convictions. I think that's just so far removed from his little brain. But I think he's operating in the same mode he did when he was in the corner office in Trump org, where he would file thousands of lawsuits and, to your point, drag people through financial and emotional hardship, perhaps ruin people, bankrupt people, humiliate people, make them lose sleep at night. It's all about the cruelty. That's what he does. So if that's his end goal, doesn't matter, which is probably why he's posting the shit he posts, because it doesn't matter to him. It's just all part of his little game. But,
because it's not, it's I think it's astute observation. And so if that's the case, because I do think that, as a lawyer, you're kind of like, I can't believe his attorneys are letting him post this stuff. It is so disadvantageous to his legal case or to the legal case against these people. And yet I think you're right. If the process is the punishment to a large extent, the tweets, the truths, whatever, none of that really matters.
And, you bring up lawyers. We know from the first Trump administration that a lot of his lawyers lost their licenses and there were consequences. They were held accountable for walking into a courtroom and filing frivolous lawsuits and spreading bullshit. And it just makes me wonder, do they not think that could ever happen again, and to them?
Yeah. I wish I had a good answer to that. I mean, I think it's right. So people like Rudy Giuliani and Jeffrey Clark, right? And so individuals both who were kind of part of the administration, but also a number of folks who were involved in the effort between the election and, January 6th to, sort of stoke doubts about the election's integrity and actually to engage in frivolous litigation challenging the results in individual states. And there were professional disciplinary consequences for a number of those attorneys. And I guess the fact that some of them, despite suffering these I think serious professional and reputational consequences are, kind of again in both the good graces of Donald Trump and, actually exercising some role in the kind of Trump orbit or the actual administration, either inside or outside. I think that fact may mitigate concerns that it's actually going to be, particularly damaging long term to make common cause with this administration and some of its pursuits. So I think that that's part of it. I think that there's, maybe there's some view that they're going to try to weaken the kind of ability of these professional associations, bar associations, the American Bar Association, which is not like the state bars that are actually disciplining people, but there has been an effort to target and to discredit the American Bar Association. So I think that may be part of it, that the kind of, the sort of wrecking ball the administration is taking toward institutions includes a lot of institutions of the legal profession. So you may think that, well, the institutions that sort of held the line and actually did hold to account people involved in promoting this big lie, they're not on the sort of strongest footing right now anyway. So, who knows long term if they're even going to be able to mete out any kind of real punishments of consequence. And so for that reason, I'm not going to worry too much. But I think that's mistaken. I think that there's enormous legal risk in promoting the kind of lawless agenda of this administration, whether we're talking about frivolous prosecutions against political rivals, or I think plainly unconstitutional moves on personnel, firings, things like the Department of Justice officials that you were talking about a couple of minutes ago, and who knows what else is in store, and, sort of ordering lethal strikes potentially in violation of both domestic and international law. I think there's genuine legal peril for the individuals involved in those strikes of boats in the Caribbean and now in the Pacific. So I think that there's real risk for those lawyers, and I think that to their detriment, they, I think, are under some impression that there isn't.
Yeah, well, I think a warning sign for them should be the outrage that several judges have already been expressing. Yeah. What about the Bolton indictment? That's got some substance to it, right?
It seems as though it has clearly more substance to it than, say, James or Comey. There seems to have been actual transmission of classified material. I mean, I will say I think it's probably right to draw a distinction that I think that the sort of like righteous outrage, and kind of understandably so, at the Comey and James indictments, is somewhat distinguishable from, I think, the reaction that met the Bolton indictment. And I don't think that's because of sort of politics or ideology. I think it's genuinely, there seems to be an evidentiary difference between the sort of misconduct alleged against Comey and James and the misconduct.
But it's also like
Bolton.
we've all been conditioned to try to find that one not insane Trump moment or thing that he does. So it's like, so when someone gets indicted and it's just not completely insanely frivolous, it's like, oh, this one's got legs. But it's still an indictment of an enemy, right?
It's still an indictment of an enemy. So I think you're right that there should be it should be somewhat, it needs to be scrutinized in that light. And yet lots of low-level officials have been prosecuted for mishandling and transmitting classified information. And so it seems that conduct alleged here, these are sort of documents that were retained and transmitted in conjunction with Bolton's preparation of his book. And it seems as though there may be some there. But you're right. It also has to be understood in the context of, Bolton's on the enemies list. And I think we need to scrutinize very closely any charge brought against anybody on the enemies list.
Yeah. And there's also the delicious irony of the classified document stealer-in-chief indicting John Bolton over the same alleged crime.
Of far less serious. I think that is to be clear. The allegations against Bolton involving classified information are far less serious than the Jack Smith allegations against Donald Trump for the tranches of clearly classified documents, right? So the Bolton stuff was diaries primarily that might have had information that is classified information, but, not marked documents that said on their face, many of them, secret, top secret, TS, and that contain things like nuclear secrets. I mean, I don't think anything in the Bolton allegation comes close to the seriousness of the offenses alleged involving classified documents alleged against Donald Trump.
No, and we've had testimony back then. Trump ordered his subordinates to hide these documents. So that's
Right.
that's a major difference as well. Let's talk about the National Guard. There's a trial that began in Portland this week over the deployment there. Any significant developments, how that's going?
So we have a few things happening at a few different levels involving the National Guard in Portland. So a district court in Portland initially found, in an opinion by actually a Donald Trump appointee from his first term, that essentially the factual predicate that the president had relied on in deploying the National Guard to Portland was totally untethered from facts, and that the National Guard thus was unlawful, right? There needs to be a factual predicate for deploying the National Guard. That district court opinion was then put on hold by a panel of 3 judges on the Ninth Circuit, 2 of whom were also Trump appointees. But in a dissent, a Democratic appointee on the court, but not like a real far left Democratic appointee or anything, basically called for the full Ninth Circuit to vacate that panel opinion, and that has happened. So now the district court opinion temporarily barring the National Guard from being deployed in Portland is back in effect while the full Ninth Circuit considers whether to uphold or reverse it. And as you said, that's temporary. And so kind of proceedings are ongoing to develop further facts about, what the conditions on the ground in Portland were and whether there was any kind of justification. And there's been some revisions of the initial factual representations made by the Trump administration that make the case that there was a need to send the Guard to Portland even weaker than it appeared at the outset.
And what about Chicago and the U.S. Supreme Court asking for more information this week, and specifically this debate over the definition of regular forces?
Yeah. So in Chicago, we have sort of 2 different tracks. There was a case brought by the Attorney General of Illinois and maybe some Chicago officials as well, right, challenging the National Guard in Chicago, and that was the challenge was successful in the district court. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals declined to stay that district court order. And so, of course, the Trump administration ran right to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court sat on that application for a couple of weeks and I think made everybody pretty nervous, although it wasn't clear in what direction things were going. But it seemed as though somebody maybe was writing something very lengthy. And then we got, as you just mentioned, we got a request from the Supreme Court for supplemental briefing. So for the parties to address a question actually that wasn't explicitly addressed in the lower court litigation, which was essentially the statute upon which the president relied in, calling up and deploying the National Guard requires the president basically to show that they cannot, the regular forces are insufficient to engage in the kind of protection of federal personnel and property, and thus it was necessary to use the National Guard. So I think everybody had been assuming that the regular forces referred to federal agencies like ICE and CBP and other federal officials. And if you couldn't get, this is all, of course, about immigration enforcement, right? That's what the federal government is doing. And that's why they're, suggesting they need to call in the National Guard to protect against protesters and to, help protect the federal officials engaging in that immigration enforcement. So they're saying we need backup essentially for ICE and other federal agents. But a law professor, Marty Lederman, actually filed a brief saying, no, actually the regular forces are the military, not these law enforcement agencies. And if that's the case, then the whole question is a bit different. Do you need the regular military and then that's what the Guard is supposed to be in support of or kind of supplementary to? So anyway, no one's really focused on that question, and that's what the Supreme Court asked for additional briefing on. And so those briefs are due in mid-November. So I think we know that there are not going to be any rulings from the Supreme Court on this Chicago National Guard issue before then. And so that means the district court opinion is back in effect. So the National Guard is restricted in its activities in Chicago. ICE is still engaging in incredibly aggressive immigration enforcement, and there is separate litigation ongoing with tons of developments happening all the time regarding what ICE is doing, tear gassing without warning. They're now under a district court order to be wearing body cams, which they hadn't been doing, and there was an order that the head of the activities in Chicago, a guy named Bovino, had to do daily check-ins before the district court in Chicago, although that part of the order is now on a temporary pause at the Court of Appeals level. So a lot of activity in Chicago.
It just seems like this is left up to so much judicial interpretation.
Yes.
That term regular forces is so vague. And when you consider that the court has a 6-3 conservative majority and basically put him above the law a year ago, it's kind of hard to imagine they're not going to ultimately say, sure, go ahead, Donald, do what you want.
I mean, I think that's without knowing anything else about any dispute that is pending before the Supreme Court, but that there's a legal question that, reasonable minds or minds in general might differ about, and that Trump is pressing one interpretation of the law. Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be a safe bet at this point in time to, predict the court will side with Trump.
I mean, it's just like when you think about the tariff case, right?
Yeah.
The language in the Constitution is very clear. Power of the purse strings, tariffs are under the purview of Congress.
Yeah. They're
Black
taxes.
and
yeah. Congress
white,
taxes.
period.
Yeah. Yeah.
This, it's like, however you want to define regular forces.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, but that's all. I mean, but to your point about tariffs, I don't know that, I think you're right that the Constitution gives the power to tax to Congress. This is the president exercising the power to tax. And that seems on its face to be very constitutionally dubious. But of course, there's a statute in which Congress has given some of its power to the president. I don't think that statute, this IEPA statute, actually gives the president the power to announce these just wild sweeping tariffs on the thinnest of factual justifications, regarding fentanyl or, trade imbalances or the other reasons that he has provided for levying different kinds of tariffs. But I think there, too, the smart money is probably on the court siding with Donald Trump. I mean, I wish I had a better theory that would help explain why, apart from, as you said, it's 6 conservative Republican appointees, and they are determined to augment the power of this Republican president. But in my lifetime of, and a lot of years as a lawyer and a law professor, the justices have been far more successful in at least attempting to engage in sort of impartial, to a degree, always, colored by their priors, but to a degree, impartial legal reasoning and analysis. And there's a lot less of that happening, or at least, the legal reasoning analysis that's happening seems so outcome driven that it's very hard for me to buy right now that they're doing anything kind of recognizably law.
Yeah. Let's talk about the shutdown for a second, because there's a critical case that's pending, the lawsuit that's been filed over SNAP. We got some indication or reporting yesterday that the judge in that case is kind of leaning towards ordering the government to at least partially fund the SNAP and WIC benefits before they expire tomorrow. Where does that stand? How do you think where's that going to land?
I don't know. I think the district courts have been, the vast majority of them, when the administration is engaging in lawless action, district courts have been very willing to call the administration out on that. I will confess to not being deeply steeped in this case, but my general understanding is that there is a statutory provision that's, it's like a slush fund that there's a decent amount of funds that the administration could, with a flip of a switch, allow to flow to SNAP recipients, many of whom need to feed their children using these SNAP benefits. So, I mean, a lot of the stuff that's tied up in the budget is incredibly life or death for, millions of Americans, tens of millions of Americans. Healthcare is sometimes immediate and sometimes at a bit of a remove, but food is always like an immediate and pressing concern. And so I think that if the statutory language is, and again, I have confessed not to having studied it, but if the language is as clear as it sounds, I do think that there is a good chance that this court just requires the spigot to be turned on, the benefits to flow. And I'm not actually even sure this administration would want to press on appeal.
Right. I mean, the optics of that are
we
not
want to
good.
keep the, so it may just be that a district court could have the last word, in particular because their caucus is a little bit, Josh Hawley had a long piece in the Times a couple of days ago, essentially fund SNAP. So I think that I can see that actually being an outcome that they could live with and maybe even would be happy with, which is the district court telling them they've got to do it, and they essentially just take the loss and let the benefits flow. And obviously that would be enormously important to people who rely on those benefits to feed their families.
Yeah, and so much of this depends on, we have Election Day coming up in a few days. We have very critical governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia. You recently wrote a piece in the Daily Pennsylvanian about the state Supreme Court election there. Why is that race so important?
Well, state court elections are sort of an odd thing. In many ways, like if you're most familiar with the federal system, federal judges are appointed. They're not elected. There's something that seems strange about electing judges in general. They don't stand up and promise to make particular policies in the way that politicians do. But in about half the states, we elect, and more than that, we elect some of our judges. And so it's actually extremely common. Sometimes it matters a great deal. So there have been extremely consequential judicial elections for the state Supreme Court in the state of Wisconsin in the last 3 electoral cycles. And we have in Pennsylvania a critically important set of retention elections. So judges are in Pennsylvania on the highest court in the state. You are either elected or appointed by the governor, and then you have to stand every 10 years for retention elections. And it's now a court with a Democratic majority. So these judges run with partisan affiliation, and they stand for retention that way too. So all 3 of these are Democratic justices up for a retention election. And if all 3 lose, and maybe, there's some kind of split, but very likely they are all retained or they are all not retained. If they're all not retained, then the Pennsylvania Supreme Court becomes tied 2-2 because they won't be on the court anymore. And the governor, with Senate confirmation, could fill those vacancies, but it's not clear that he'd be able to do that because there's kind of an impasse between the governor and the Senate in that state right now. Anyway, so a 2-2 tie would be enormously destabilizing in that we just wouldn't have clear binding law in the state on some matters. And, so there'd be deadlock and just also kind of inefficiency. And back to sort of 2020 big lie election litigation, which we were talking about a few minutes ago, it's obviously Pennsylvania is an enormously important state in presidential election years. It was a key focus of the kind of Trump team's efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And so I think that having, sort of putting partisan labels aside, having rule of law justices on that court and also having a functioning court is critically important to future presidential elections. And so I wrote the piece in the Daily Pennsylvanian just to sort of make sure that this kind of off-cycle, under-the-radar election was in people's minds. So we don't in Pennsylvania have a gubernatorial election. There's no mayoral like there is in the city of New York. The DA in Philadelphia is up for re-election. So there are definitely important races on that ballot. But I just really think that both in Pennsylvania and in several other states where there are judges on the ballot, it's so important that people incorporate into their lives as, voters and participants in democracy, like judges. Courts matter enormously. If that wasn't clear to people, hopefully post 2020 and today it is clear. Just want to make sure people do not forget about that Pennsylvania Supreme Court election.
That is such a good point because that's what Republicans have focused on for years now. Yeah. The state, the local level, election boards, school boards, we all get hung up on the national political landscape. But these races are so critical because they often dictate how we all live our lives.
They do. State law much more than federal law, but yeah, and I think you're right that there's been an asymmetry in terms of how kind of the long-term building power through local and state elected office is something that the Republican Party has done much better than the Democratic Party. State legislatures, state election boards, both of those. So that's just an important lesson that I think Democrats have to learn.
My last question is a little tongue-in-cheek, perhaps, but it's still rooted in reality. Okay, I want to ask you about the East Wing. Can Donald Trump just go knock shit down wherever he wants? Like if he wants to take down the Washington Memorial and put up the Arc de Trump, is there anything or any statute anywhere that could stop him? Or are we all just going to stand on the mall and lament the bulldozers as they knock this thing down?
I think he has just learned an important lesson about, kind of forgiveness being better than permission, and that he's just doing it and daring it being all of it, the East Wing just the most recent it, and kind of daring the institutions to stop him. And so far they are not stopping him. So I do think there is a statute that I think prevents him from putting up a monument to himself and to destroying the other monuments. But he has this is why I think when the Supreme Court very early on started granting him permission to violate statutes, including statutes that prevent him from firing heads of independent agencies, which sounds wonky, but I think is so important on its own terms, but also because when the court says it's fine, violate a statute, at least temporarily, we'll consider down the road if in fact you had to follow the statute. They have provided a permission structure for him to violate statute after statute, and I think the Constitution as well. And so I honestly think there is a straight line between the Supreme Court, both its immunity decision last year and some of its many recent rulings further empowering this president, and just the physical destruction that we can see with our eyes on the grounds of the White House right now. I think that John Roberts bears an enormous amount of responsibility for that.
Yeah. Well, this is how crazy it would be. Like in my Hollywood scenario, if he really wanted to take down the Washington Monument and put up the Arc de Trump, what he would do is, because we know from the restrictions that fall under the commission that we're supposed to review the East Wing demolition, that they only review construction plans, right? They don't get to review demolition plans. So he'll demolish the Washington Memorial and then say, hey, I have nothing to do with the construction. My friends created a PAC. They raised money and they want to put it up and we're going to approve it. And who's going to stop him? Because he's in charge of everything, right? So he'll approve the erection, no pun intended, of the Arc de Triomphe.
Arc de Triomphe. I'm worried that you're manifesting this, Andy.
I'm just trying to get ahead of this.
That sounds very plausible.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be
You're looking around the
surprised.
corner. Yeah. No, I think regrettably, that sounds like entirely
It's plausible, right? Strange times we're living in. Kate, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you come back and chat with us again sometime.
Happy to. Thank you for having me.
All righty. Bye-bye. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Langell. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.